Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I am your Mistress of Ceremonies, and I would love to welcome you to Nerd Nite. Yay! Thank you all for being here. I understand that there's some sort of a basketball game going on or something, whatever, but this is much more exciting in my opinion. So I'm very pleased that you guys are all here. As you know, we are here to talk about I Will Revive using Naloxone to reverse overdoses. And we have 4 speakers here for you this evening. They're going to trade off as we go along, and I'm going to make sure I get everybody's names and titles right. First of all, we have Dr. Gary Oxman, who I've worked with before. He is the former health officer for Multnomah County and the Tri-County Health Officer, so Clackamas and Washington County, I believe. And he's recently retired, but has been working on the naloxone issue and various other health issues for quite a few years, and we're pleased that he is here joining us this evening. He's going to give us some background on the issue and I believe some more on the legislation that went through in July of last year to make naloxone available to the public, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that shortly. We have Maayan Simkes. She's the epidemiology fellow with the health department's communicable disease department, and she's new here in Portland, so we're glad to welcome her on stage here in just a few minutes. We have Lindsay Jenkins, who is the research analyst with the STD, HIV, and hepatitis C program with the health department. And in the description, they were saying, I think this kind of describes me as well. The quote is, "People think she loves data, but she says she's really just nosy and likes surveying people about very personal things." So fill out your evaluations on your tables for me, and I want to get not that much personal data, but some. And then finally, we have Haven Wheelock, who is from Outside In. And Outside In is a nonprofit that works with homeless youth and does needle exchange and various things like that. And she has been working there for 8 years, I believe, and she'll tell you a little bit more about what it's like being on the ground working with people who need those kinds of services. And like I said, we'll have all of them come up here on stage and give a presentation, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. We'll have a microphone down here on the bottom floor and also one up in the balcony. And I realize that this is could potentially be a hot button issue for some people since we are talking about opiates and overdoses and things like that. And we welcome comments and we welcome questions, but when it does come time for Q&A, just make sure that there's a question mark at the end of whatever statement you're choosing to make with the microphones. You're certainly welcome to come up and chat with the presenters afterward, but we do want to make sure that you're asking a question that they can answer so that we can all learn from that. So I would like to welcome our speakers up on stage. Please welcome them to the stage. We've got Gary Oxman, Maayan Simkes, Haven Wheelock, and Lindsay. And you're going first? Okay, and take it away.
Thank you, Amanda. All right, thank you everyone for being here. We are, again, Haven, Lindsay, Gary, and Maayan, and we are 4 of the biggest overdose nerds in all of Portland, maybe the world. We're very proud of this fact. And we know why we're here. We know we care about naloxone. We know we could talk about it for hours, but we want to know why you're here, so I can actually see you okay. How many of you before tonight knew a little bit about naloxone, you kind of thought it was cool, and you wanted to come learn a little more about it? Okay, fair number of hands. And honestly, how many of you truly knew nothing about naloxone before walking in the door? Oh, goody. Excellent. So that's why we're here. We're here to teach you. We're here to have a conversation. We want to hear what you think and what questions you have, because this is something we all care so much about. So this is where we represent. Again, we have Outside In and Multnomah County Health Department, and we're excited to be here. So let me just set the stage by saying naloxone, which Gary will describe in depth for you, is not new. We're going to talk about it like it's this exciting, incredible drug, and you know what it is. But it's been around since the 70s, and we have ambulance personnel and ER folks who have been using it to revive people since then. So while it's exciting and new, what's really exciting is that we've figured out a better way of using it. How to get it into the right people's hands, how to save more people's lives by making sure the right people have it at the right time. That being said, let me hand it over to the doc to start answering some of the sciencey stuff.
as a musician, it's always a practice of mine to do a sound check. So is my vocal volume okay? Yeah, okay, good. I'm also a musician who's going deaf, and so I'm using a new sound system tonight, in-ear monitors rather than my usual hearing aids. And I can hear myself wonderfully. But in order for me to hear you when we get to the question and answer period, I request that you use the microphone and speak distinctly. So I'm going to be covering a little bit of the basic science on naloxone. And by training, I'm a physician. And the nice thing about being a physician is, well, at least two nice things. One is you get to use PowerPoint slides, although my slides were censored to show more pictures and less words, so I'm going to have to use a piece of paper to follow along as well. The other thing is that, and this will be horrifying to some people, but medicine is a trade degree. It's not really a science degree. You get to use science, and sometimes in great deal of depth, but sometimes it's also just in the background here. So this is really fun for me to be able to kind of delve back into the science and try to share that with you about naloxone. So what is an overdose? And what we're talking about tonight specifically with naloxone is opiate overdose. So to answer the question, what is an overdose, you have to answer the question, what is an opiate? And so a little bit on terminology here. Opium is a flower that grows many places around the world, mostly in temperate climates. And it's, you can see in the upper left there, an opium pod, which has been slashed, leading to the lacrima somniferum, or the opiate tears. And that's raw opium coming out of there. And that material, after you slash the pod, you scrape that stuff off, you let it sit, and ultimately that gets processed into morphine, and then from morphine into many other opiate drugs. The term opiate and opioid are used interchangeably these days, and they're not technically supposed to be, but an opiate is any drug that's derived from opium or that has actions similar to opium. And so it includes the purely natural products like opium, as well as the drugs that are derived from opium, so things like morphine, heroin, etc. Opioids, in a technical sense, started to mean drugs that are synthetic and have opiate-like effects. But the terms opiate and opioid have become interchangeable lately. And there on the slide, you see some of our opiate friends, Vicodin tablets, morphine, and can't read that, methadone, which is totally synthetic. So when we talk about opiates, we need to really talk about the physiology of opiates. And human beings and many, many other animals have what's called an endogenous opiate system. And what that means is that we are built equipped to handle external opiates, but the reason we're built that way is we have our own internal opiates. And you've probably heard of things like endorphin, which is famous for the runner's high, or enkephalin, or dynorphins. Those are all of our natural opiates, which are part of our own physiology. And actually, they appeared on the evolutionary scene relatively early, probably about 400 million years ago, with the rise of jawed fishes. So when evolution transitioned from strictly eels to jawed fishes, that's probably about when the opioid system showed up. To look at it in a teleologic sense, why would we have an opiate system? And the answer is because it promotes survival. It allows us to perform under stress. It allows us to perform in the face of pain and fear because of the relaxing and the pain relieving properties of that endogenous opiate system. It promotes healing and rest. When we're injured, our natural opiate system kicks in. We have pain relief, we have sedation from that, and so we rest, and that allows healing. So it's part of our overall physiologic balancing system. We also need to look at the miracle of plant and animal coevolution. And basically, the opiates that are produced by opium fit very nicely with the receptors in our brains that run the opiate system. So those two things have co-evolved, and indeed, there's some evidence that that opium was probably in use at least as long ago as 30,000 years. There have been opiate seed fossils found in Neanderthal excavation sites, which I think is pretty interesting, the idea of Neanderthals harvesting opium. So how do opiates work? So basically, what you see on the slides here are the opiate receptors, those blue sort of cup-like things. And then you see these little green nodules that are showing up. And what you're looking at there is the cleft in between two parts of the nerve, the sending part and the receiving part of a nerve. And so the opiates enter the brain, they get to that point in the nerve, and they also get to other nerves peripherally around the body. And then what you can see over on the right is that those little green nodules then have been attached to the opiate receptors and have activated the opiate receptors. And that sets into motion a chain reaction of chemical events really at the cellular level, which primarily impact nerve transmission, but also can impact some hormone release as well. So when we start to look at opiate overdose, overdose can really be thought of as oversaturation of the opiate receptor system. And so when you look at what happens with opiate receptors, you've got three primary receptors. You have what's called the delta receptor, which produces analgesia or resistance to pain. It produces euphoria, and also it's involved in physical dependence. The kappa receptor is involved also in analgesia and sedation, and also in some behavioral factors, like some feelings of depersonalization, delirium, and other strange behaviors. And finally, the mu receptor, which is really the primary one for pain relief, and that's involved in analgesia rather. It also produces respiratory depression, which is really key to overdose. It produces euphoria, involved in physical dependence, and it slows down the action of the gut, slows down peristalsis and slows down gut secretions. So these opiate chemicals really do a lot of things in our body. So as I said, when you talk about overdose, you're talking about oversaturation of the receptor system and overactivation of those receptors, and really an exaggerated reaction to what the opiate or opioid normally does, whether it's a natural opioid, and you never see an overdose with natural opioids, or whether it's synthetic, and you do see that all the time, as you'll hear about. So overdose is very common. If you talk with people who have been using heroin in particular for a long time, it's a rare person you'll find who hasn't overdosed. People overdose quite frequently. Most of those overdoses, fortunately, are not fatal, but some are. And the thing that happens in a fatal overdose is the prominence of respiratory depression. And in effect, what overload of the opiates does is it makes the body insensitive to a rising level of CO2 in the body. Normally, if we get too much CO2 in our body, we just start breathing more rapidly, we blow it off, and we return our physiologic balance. In opiate overdose, that doesn't happen, and so people just accumulate more and more CO2. In effect, the cells are not able to exchange CO2 and oxygen effectively, and we end up dying. The heart ends up stopping, and we end up dying from that. So the other thing about opiate overdose is that the risk really varies a lot. It varies from person to person, probably due to genetic factors, where we're endowed with different numbers and different intensities of opiate receptors in our brain. But it also varies within the same person over time. And that can vary because of circumstances. So for example, if you're addicted or physically dependent on an opiate and you quit using it for a while, you would develop a profound sensitivity to that drug. So, classic story is an addict gets put in jail. They are without their drug for a period of weeks. They get back on the street. They go back and use the same dose they used to use, and they die. They die with a dose they could have tolerated easily before the jail episode. So things change over time. And the important thing to realize about opiate overdose, as you'll hear from my colleagues, is it's treatable. And you can, with naloxone, you can take a potentially fatal overdose and make it a not fatal overdose. And you'll hear more about that in a minute. So I think it's time for me to get the hook. Haven, it's all you.
Hi, I'm Haven. I'm coordinator for the syringe exchange, and I want to show this lovely picture up here. This picture is from Overdose Awareness Day from 2011. And Overdose Awareness Day is it's an event that happens at the end of the summer to really honor and bring tribute to people who we've lost for overdose. I think people who use drugs often are stigmatized, and therefore it's really easy to forget that we're talking about all this hard science. We're talking about all these things and these neurotransmitters, but we're also really talking about people here. And we're talking about people's kids. We're talking about people's friends. We're talking about people we care about. So part of my job, because I work with these people and have worked with these people for a really long time, and is to always bring it back to some of that. And I get the honor and the privilege of telling their stories because we've got clients who are using this stuff. They're saving people from overdose. They're aware of overdose. So I just want to throw out there that that's kind of my role. This was 2011, and 2011 was it was easily the hardest summer I've ever had in my career of working in syringe exchange. We lost 12 people that summer. Some of them were new users who just were pretty inexperienced. Other were longtime drug users who knew all of the recommendations and they knew all of the things that we had talked about. Because we've always talked about overdose prevention in the exchange. It's something people worry about. People don't want to die. So we talk about preventing overdose by not mixing drugs, some of the things that Gary was saying, not using as much as soon as you get out of jail. We would talk about calling 911 and getting help on the way quickly, but none of that was enough that summer. I felt like I was talking about doing test shots till I was blue in the face, and people were literally becoming blue in the face. And the community was scared, but I was pissed. I was really pissed. And the reason I was really pissed is because of naloxone. And because I knew, having worked in other places, that this was being distributed in our communities, and we weren't there yet, but we are now. So Gary, will you explain what naloxone is and how it does its magic?
What is naloxone? So naloxone is a prescription drug. It's been in existence, as Mayan talked about, since the 70s. It was licensed first in 1971. It's not a controlled drug. It's not an opiate. It's not something that's addictive. It doesn't have any psychological effects. It doesn't make you high. And indeed, the amazing thing about naloxone is in the absence of opiates on board in a person, it doesn't do anything. It's just like, it's incredibly specific. So it's a really cool drug. And it's what's called a pure opiate antagonist. When you look at different opiates, some of them have a tendency to totally turn on the receptors. Some have a tendency to totally turn off the receptors, like naloxone, to block the receptors. And others have a tendency to turn some on and turn some off. But naloxone is really on the far radical end of things. It blocks the receptors, and it does so really thoroughly. Unfortunately, it only blocks them for 30 to 60 minutes, and some of the drugs hang around a lot longer than 30 or 60 minutes. So a person can overdose, be given naloxone, they'll wake up, they'll be okay, and if they're taking long-acting opiates, the overdose can come back in a period of 30 or 60 minutes, and so that's why it's really important. When Haven will talk with you about the actual program, it's really important to stay on top of folks. The drug is incredibly safe. Great benefit to risk ratio. There are very few reports in the medical literature about people getting severely ill or dying after naloxone, but all of those have been in the setting of major surgery with all kinds of physiologic disruption. And there's almost no evidence that it's harmful. And when you're in a situation like an overdose, when somebody is turning blue and looks like they're about to die, that really remote risk of problems is well worth taking. And so that's why I say it's a really good benefit to risk ratio. Here's what happens. So you remember our little green globule friends, which are the opiates here. So here's a situation where an opiate's been administered and it's made its way into the brain and between the ends of the nerve cell. And the opiates lock onto those receptors, they're bound. And if all the receptors are saturated or hypersaturated, then you can get into an overdose situation. So then you administer naloxone, which are the blue globs, the blue polyhedrons coming on board there. And what happens is that the naloxone competes more successfully for its spot on the receptor than the opiate does it. So in effect, with the normal amount of loosening there is between the drug and the receptor, the naloxone in effect is able to push the opiate off and glom onto that receptor itself. And then what you end up with is naloxone tightly bound to those receptors for its 30 to 60 minute duration of action. And so why does naloxone work? Well, it works because it blocks a couple of the receptors. It blocks the mu receptor and it blocks the kappa receptor. It's felt not to block the delta receptor as well. But so when you look at the words that are crossed out there, when somebody's having an overdose and they're unresponsive to stimulation, they won't wake up, they're limp, that's because of the sedative effects of the kappa and the mu receptors. You wipe those out, you reverse some of that. The breathing becomes slow, shallow, or no breathing, and as a result, people turn blue or pale. You block the mu receptor, you reverse that action, and people start to breathe again. Similarly, the snoring, gurgling, choking that you see, that's a combination of respiratory depression and sedation. You block the mu and kappa receptors, and those things go away. And vomiting is part of respiratory depression, just low oxygen in the brain, and the sedation. Again, you block the mu and the kappa, and you reverse those things. So naloxone gets right to the right part of the physiology and reverses it. And so it treats the overdose by blocking the receptors rather than activating those receptors. I hope that all makes sense. So, back to Haven.
So Gary explains all the science behind it. All I can say about naloxone is it's magic. It really is. Has anyone seen it used or anyone used it other than me? Amy's used it. Yeah, there's a handful of people who've seen it used. Thank you, all of you, for being heroes. But really, this drug, somebody goes from being completely unresponsive. They're not responding to you screaming at them. You're like rubbing your knuckles on them. They're not responding to pain. People are yelling and screaming, and you start breathing for this person, and there's no one responding. And then you give them this medication, and within a couple of minutes, they're like, what's your problem? Why are you freaking out? Like, it is really bizarre because they typically don't know that they had overdosed. They don't understand why people are scared. They just know that you're messing with them and now they're awake. It's magic. The other thing that's really magic about naloxone, this is it, by the way. It's really little. You can't probably see it at all. But it's a small bottle. And this bottle makes people heroes. It turns like ordinary people into people who are actually saving people's lives. And that empowerment leads them to be ready to engage in different levels of conversation around health behaviors, around behavior change. And how cool is it to be a superhero? One example of a story that I love this story, is about a young guy. He's like maybe 20 years old, maybe. And he and a friend were hanging out, and they were hanging out in a public space. And his friend was overdosing, and he's like sitting on the couch, and they realized that his friend had stopped breathing. And then staff at the place responded, and they got him on the floor and called 911, got an ambulance on the way. And this kid was like, I have naloxone if you want me to take care of this. And the staff was just like, what? Oh, I don't know, whatever. And they let him do it, and they gave it to him. And the next day I got to work, and the guy was revived, and everything was fine, and he walked down the stairs to the ambulance on his own accord, even though he was just needing someone to breathe for him. But the next day, I got calls from 3 or 4 different staff members of that place saying, I never knew this kid, like, you wouldn't even notice this person, and yet they were calling to be like, he's a hero. And I kind of think he is. So, you want to talk, Mayan?
So Gary and Haven have given you a really nice picture of how naloxone can affect an individual, how it can restore breathing, bring someone from the brink of death truly right back to life. But for those of us who work in public health, we have to think about it at the community level. So let's zoom out for a moment. And how many of you in some way are related to the health world? It's a fair number of you. That is well over half, I would say, in the audience. Somehow you're related to health. Fantastic. So some of you also may know a version of the story I'm going to tell. But bear with me. I like my version. So let's pretend that everyone in this room is somehow related to the health field. We've got our dentists, we've got our public health nurses, we've got our infectious disease doctors, we've got the ambulance folks, we've got our epidemiologists. We're the cool ones. Just kidding. No, we really are, though. So anyway, we are walking along this river, right? We are so beautiful day, walking along the river to set up a picnic. Because it's Portland, we'll probably make veggie burgers and veggie dogs and all that jazz. So as we walk along the river, we notice there's a baby in the river. That's a problem. So one of the doctors jumps in, grabs the baby, brings it to shore, starts drying it off, making sure it's breathing. And before we know it, there are more babies in the river, and they haven't stopped coming yet. So people are jumping in the river to grab these babies, bring them back to life, dry them off. Because everybody's a little worried. Babies in a river, really? So a group of us say, wait a second, there's babies in a river. Who's throwing the babies in the river? And so we start heading upstream, and we start looking for the source. Where are those babies coming from? If we're going to save all these babies, we need people jumping in the river right away. We need people running up to meet them as they start coming down. And we need people going to the top to figure out where they're coming from. When we talk about any public health issue, we have to think about the fact that there's a full spectrum of opportunity where we can step in and intervene and prevent the final outcome. So when we start thinking about opiate overdose, we also have this full spectrum, this full river of opportunity where we have different people working to prevent overdose deaths. And so let's take a look at it for opiate overdose. What does it look like? So the first step, we have to think about the social and cultural values, the traditions around drug use in a community. Some communities, the tradition might sort of dictate that it's kind of normal for there to be drugs around. In others, it might be completely unacceptable. In our community, we have to wonder, where are the drugs coming from? What's the availability? Are they coming from a farm, a little bit inside the state, but in the back country? Are they coming from across the border, in the neighboring state? Maybe this is some international drug trade with an end market right here in Portland. Or maybe these are just drugs that are getting diverted off a shelf at a pharmacy right into the hands of the public without prescriptions. So the drugs can be coming from all over. That's one place to intervene. But next, there's the drug exposure and initiation. Every individual can be exposed for the first time in a variety of different ways. Think of the college student in their first semester, finishing up their very first or very last midterm or final exam of the year, and they just need to get through that last hour, so they're looking for that final kick, something to get them through to the end. Maybe it's somebody who went to the dentist. They had one little tooth extracted, and the dentist decided to write them a prescription for Tylenol with codeine. Could be. And maybe that doctor decided to write a prescription for, 3 months after that one little tooth was extracted. So that might move people into that next stage, into initiation, into interest and to addiction. Once you're interested and you have it available to you, what makes you want to keep going? And once you keep going, what makes you addicted? That's a physical addiction. I know Gary didn't talk too much about it. If you have questions, let us know. But that is not something you choose. You have a physical dependence. What moves you into that step? And once you have that dependence on a drug, there's a risk that you can overdose. And like Gary said, not everyone dies when they overdose. In fact, most people don't. But there are those that do. And so that's where we come in. Naloxone lives right here, right between overdose and death. That's the little naloxone slash. Imagine it's a needle. So we are here to prevent people from moving to from overdose to death. And you know what? That is the most downstream approach you can get. And some people might judge us for that and say, why bother dealing with the bottom of the stream? If you know the drugs are getting into the community, why not just get the drugs out of the community? Let's send everybody up to the top of the river and get the drugs out of our city. When we hear people say that, we say, hey, wait a second. Remember the river. What about the people who are still in the river? They have a right to life. They have a right to have a chance to be alive and to go into a treatment center to fight their addiction and to live a good life. So we collaborate with people all across the community and in all different sectors of the health world to really promote wellness and to promote awareness and to promote life. So we don't have the single best answer. We just have one that addresses risk reduction and harm reduction. But we're working with people all along the river, and everyone deserves a chance to get out of the river. So now that I'm off my pedestal for a moment, let's figure out why or how do we know that we have an opiate overdose problem in Portland, in any community? How do we even know? Well, I'm an epidemiologist, so like Lindsay, I'm a data geek. Our data nerd, I suppose, would be more appropriate for this evening. But I love data, and I get it from all over the place. And as a public health field, we use data to help us understand what is happening within a community. So we might look at emergency room data or hospital data to figure out who's showing up with the overdoses in the community. We might contact the ambulance folks, AMR, and see, are they sending ambulances to the same places over and over and over again? We might call them frequent flyers, sort of a common term. But what about vital statistics? So those are going to be your death records. That can tell us a little bit about who's dying to help us understand the population we're serving. In fact, let's take a look at it across the country. So you'll see this is a map of all the counties in the United States. The darker red they are, the more opiate overdoses, both heroin and prescription, there were between 2006 and 2010. Let's zoom in on Oregon. There's Portland among the worst. Well, Multnomah County, you can see us right there. And for those of you who are not familiar with the area, though I'm sure most of you are, this is right along our little I-5 corridor. That shouldn't surprise most of you, since we actually do know that this is a very common drug trafficking route for heroin. So Multnomah County, not doing too hot. Let's look some more data. We've got our syringe exchange data. It was briefly mentioned that that's where Haven works and that we can get information from folks who come to the syringe exchange. They can talk to us about their experience with drugs, what's happening on the street in real time. That tells us a little bit more about what the risks are and what we need to know about what's happening. We also have the police data that can tell us a little bit about arrests. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, might tell us about the purity of the drugs that's available on the streets. We have our PDMP, our Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. Every state in the country has some form of this, which allows the prescribers of drugs to figure out where people are filling their prescriptions, if they're filling them, and just making sure that they're not doing it too much. The one state that doesn't have it, by the way, is my home state of Missouri. That is why we are the meth capital of the world. So, the last is medical examiner data. This is my baby. This is where I live. I could talk about medical examiner data all day, but I will not bore you. I'll simply say the medical examiner steps in when there is a death that is suspicious, or a death where there is no physician or healthcare provider really aware and attending that individual. They're not aware of the health issue going on. So when there is this type of an investigation, the medical examiner steps in, and it does kind of look like CSI, if you've ever seen any of those cop shows where they're doing a scene investigation. But most importantly, we get data about who is dying, when, and why. Let's look at the when. So over the past 5 years, we have our overall deaths related to opiates that the medical examiner investigated, and they go up, and they go down, and they fluctuate. We saw a peak in 2011, it dropped until 2013. We obviously don't have this year's numbers yet. So what this tells us is there's a lot of things that are actually influencing death trends in our community, specifically with opiates. We can think of a whole bunch of things that are going to make these rates go up and down. So first you might think it's the amount of drug available on the market. How much is there for everyone to access? Maybe it's the purity of the drug on the market. How strong is it? Or maybe something was mixed in without people knowing it, like fentanyl, something that will make people actually respond differently than they would expect with something they were used to. Or maybe there was a change in the access to treatment for addiction. Maybe there's more access suddenly, or maybe the demand is so high that there's simply not enough slots for people to go around, or not enough slots to go around for everyone who wants them. But that tells you that we need to look at data in a number of different ways, and we need different types of data to give us a clear and full picture of what our community actually looks like. So we look at other types of data as well, and Lindsay is going to tell you about it.
So speaking of data, we have more data that shows not only people are dying more, but also more people are using opiates. For instance, my program and Outside In, we both have needle exchanges. There's 5 sites across the county. We have 3, they have 2. This line is showing the combined visits to all 5 sites every year. Visits to our sites have gone up 48% from 2008 to 2013. Last year alone, there were over 47,000 visits to our sites. That's over 900 visits per week. We saw the same trend with the number of syringes we give out every year. That actually more than doubled in this time period, went up by 110%. And with this change, with this increase in demand for our services, our population changed as well. We started to see different people coming into the exchange than we'd ever seen before. People who were younger, people driving in from the suburbs, people in college or with college degrees, and people who were talking a lot about prescription opiates, about OxyContin, Vicodin, saying they never thought they'd use heroin, but they started with prescription opiates, and it got to a point where they couldn't afford it anymore, and heroin was cheaper, and it was stronger. And here they were at the needle exchange getting syringes. So we knew anecdotally that our population was changing, and we had a suspicion why and how, because there was an abundance of prescription opiates in the community. In about the mid-90s or so, the medical community really started a push toward prescribing more prescription opiates. But just to get a sense and collect more data, because that's what I like to do, we did a survey at our needle exchange sites. And this is a little bit old. This is from December 2011. We surveyed at all 5 of our sites for 2 weeks, as many people as we could. We actually talked to about 500 total. And of those 500 people, about 430 were heroin users. And we asked all the heroin users this question: before you began using heroin, were you hooked on prescription type opiates? Almost half of them said yes, I was hooked on prescription opiates before I started using heroin. And those people were different from the people who didn't start, who said no, I didn't start that way. They were more likely to be women, they were younger, they had more education, so they were more likely to have some college. They were newer to injecting, and they started injecting at an older age. And the fact that they were newer to injecting sort of justified our theory that this sudden increase in demand for our needle exchange services was driven by people who came to heroin from prescription opiates. And this trend was also reflected in local treatment data. So I'm going to show you a graph with 2 lines that divides treatment admissions by age. One line is going to show an older group of everyone 26 and over, and the other line will show people under 26. Primarily people 18 to 25. Not very many people represented in this data who are under 18. So you see in 2002, people under, this lower line is people under 26, this is young people. 2002, they were 21% of people getting treatment for heroin. And by 2011, they were almost half of the people. Again, we're talking about 7 years of age range, 18 to 25 for the most part, now making up almost half the people getting heroin treatment. Meanwhile, this group is, that's probably about 50 years worth of age, from 26 on to about 76. So, it wasn't just us, and it wasn't just Multnomah County. So this is a national trend as well. This data is from a survey done by the federal government every 2 years. They ask people about their drug use. And this data in particular is showing young adults who said they used heroin in the last year. And these numbers are in the they're in the thousands. So you see in 2002, they estimated based on their survey sample that 122,000 young adults had used heroin in the last year. But 10 years later, that had more than doubled to 272,000. So why do we think that naloxone is the answer? Why do we think that putting naloxone in the hands of drug users is a good idea? We already have it right now in ambulances and hospitals. Why do we think this is going to make a difference? Research shows that overdose is usually witnessed. So people don't usually overdose by themselves. There's usually someone there. That person could rescue them. That doesn't happen immediately. People don't usually take an opiate and then die on the spot. It takes time. It takes time for their breathing to slow down and for them to stop breathing altogether. That is a window of time that they can be saved. And we also know from research that people don't often call 911. It's not uncommon if you're using illegal drugs to have a fear of calling 911 for a variety of legal consequences you could face, from possession charges all the way up to homicide. So What am I going to do if I'm with my friend and they're overdosing and I don't want to call 911 and I don't have naloxone on me? I could give them rescue breathing. And rescue breathing can work, and it does work. And that is definitely a good option if you have no other options, if you don't have naloxone. But rescue breathing will take longer than naloxone. And it's not always sustainable. You can't always do it for that long. Physically, you might not be able to do it for as long as you need to. And it won't reverse an overdose as fast as naloxone. The faster you can get someone out of overdose, the better their outcomes are going to be. So those are some big reasons why we think this is a good idea. But another big reason is we know, or we think, this appears to be making a difference in places that have done this. And they've done it for a long time, and we are a little behind. But this is data from Chicago, or Cook County, Illinois, where Chicago is. You see in the mid to late 90s, this is heroin overdose deaths. They were experiencing a big spike, peaked in 2000. 2001, they start giving out naloxone at their needle exchanges to drug users. They start giving naloxone to drug users through outreach. That year, deaths fall, and they keep falling. Same thing happens in San Francisco. They're seeing well over 100 deaths per year, mid to late 90s. 2002, they start giving out naloxone at their needle exchange. They start giving naloxone to drug users through outreach. Deaths fall, and they keep falling, and they fall by a lot. You know, in 95, they were almost at 160 a year. They were averaging about 120 during this whole period. Last year, they had 8 heroin deaths in San Francisco. San Francisco has 200,000 more people than we do here in Portland. 8 deaths is incredibly low, and San Francisco has done an amazing job of getting naloxone out to the people who need it, to the people who are at risk for overdose, and who are hanging out with other people who are overdosing. This is like a work of art for me. I just want to appreciate it up on the screen. So this is a bill that a lot of us worked on last year. It got passed. We had Senator Alan Bates out of Medford and Jeff Cruz out of Roseburg, who was a Republican, is a Republican, sponsoring this bill with over 15 co-sponsors, both Democrats and Republicans, without which we would not have passed this almost unanimously. Over 80 legislators voted for it. Only one voted against it. The main thing that this bill accomplishes, it's not a great read, so I don't suggest going to look at it. It's not perfect, but it really, without it, Haven would not be able to do the life-saving work she's doing right now. And the thing that it accomplished is it said, I can get a prescription of naloxone and I can use that on someone else. It doesn't sound revolutionary, it sounds pretty simple, but with most or maybe all drugs, that is illegal. You can't, if I can't use my prescription medication on someone else, I'm committing a crime. And for the most part, in order to do this work, we have to find a prescriber who's willing to prescribe to people. And it's a little bit risky if you're a physician or nurse practitioner to do that, knowing that people can't really give naloxone to themselves. If you're overdosing, you're either unconscious or you're well on your way, and it's going to be hard to administer this drug on yourself. So this bill really enabled us to do that work, and I'm really grateful. We had a lot of great people working on it. Gary testified in committee hearings. Haven did. We had a public health nurse, Kathy Tomes. Representative Jennifer Williams, one of the co-sponsors. We're sitting in her district right now. She's great, big advocate for our cause. So with the passage of that bill, we became the 12th state in the country with the naloxone law. There's now 19. It's really gaining momentum. 7 more states passed laws after us. Ohio being the most recent after this map was made. They just passed it last month. So all these orange and striped states have naloxone laws. Striped states also have Good Samaritan laws, as well as these blue states. Good Samaritan laws, basically, in the context of overdose, protect people from drug possession charges if they call 911 in an overdose situation. That's the only thing. It doesn't protect you from anything else. As you can see, we are not a striped state. We don't have Good Sam here, but who knows what the future holds.
Community-based naloxone is the idea that we want to get this stuff into the community. We want to get it in the hands of the people who are most likely to witness an overdose. Because an overdosing person can't give it to themselves. Well, who's most likely to witness an overdose? People who use drugs, right? So the idea is to work with drug users to get this stuff to them so that they can have it when they overdose. And calling 911 is great because ambulance all has it. But as was described earlier, the amount of you have time to respond to an overdose, but that window shrinks pretty quickly. Your brain can go, 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen before brain damage starts to set in. And not all brain damage is fatal brain damage. Some of it's just like really unpleasant brain damage that can happen. So the quicker you can get people breathing on their own, the quicker you can prevent any damage from happening, because not all overdoses end in death, but they can end in brain damage along that spectrum as well. Does that kind of make sense? I think it makes sense. Awesome. So that's kind of what we're doing. And as Lindsay was saying, it's not a new concept. Like in 2010, the CDC released a report on naloxone distribution as of 2010, and there was 120 programs, almost 200 programs running throughout the country in 2010. It's 2014 now. And in that time, they had 53,000 people throughout the United States had been trained to use naloxone. And of those people, they'd had 10,000 overdose reversals reported. And that's 2010, before a whole bunch of new laws were passed, before things got cool, before we started doing it. So what are we doing? So that's my door. It's really exciting. So the law was signed by the governor on June 6th. He passed our bill into law, and then the law actually said we had to have the state health authority, the Oregon Health Authority, create rules on what the training protocol would look like. Those rules miraculously went into effect really quickly within 1 month. It was July 9th, darn it. July 9th, the law became official and got posted on their website. That happened at 10 a.m. I started giving it out at 2 p.m. that same day. Yeah, it was probably the happiest day of my life. Easily the happiest day of my life. So this is the board. This is the extent. This is the extent of the advertising that we've really done for this. Is just this one whiteboard in the middle of the exchange lobby. The idea is that we wanted to make sure that our program kept barriers as low as possible for people. We wanted to make sure that people were able to get it, because the more we get this into the community, the more lives will be saved. In an ideal world where I get everything I want, no one will use an opiate of any type. So whether it's taking a Vicodin to injecting heroin without there being naloxone present. I want it everywhere. But we can't afford to give it everywhere right now. So we're focusing on the injectors because that's who we have coming to us. And so we wanted it to be easy. So our trainings are offered noon to 4 on demand, which means a client can walk in and say, Haven, I want some naloxone. I'm like, sweet, sit, let's do this. And we'll train them. Trainings take 20 minutes to, I think the longest was ever been 2 hours, but that guy had a lot of questions. We're doing it just in our syringe exchange, both our downtown location and our location on the other side of the river in Clackamas County. That actually just started at Clackamas this month, but we're training people there. Right now, we're only focusing on injectors or people who are directly connected to them. The only reason that that's what we're focusing on right now, so before any of you ask, how do I get it? Our funding that's just all the money we have for it. So right now, it's if you're using opiates, not necessarily just injectors, but if you're using opiates or living with someone who does, then we can make that happen. So what are in these trainings? Well, it's not like that. It is not that. It's way simpler than that. It is an injection, but it's an intramuscular injection, so it just has to go into a major muscle. It's not going into anyone's heart. The state has outlined the trainings pretty clearly. Trainings need to cover what are the signs and symptoms of an overdose, so you will know what's happening when somebody is overdosing. It goes over how to give rescue breathing, so how to breathe for someone when they're not breathing for themselves. It goes over how to put someone in recovery position, how to actually give the naloxone, what to do after you've given someone naloxone, because they're going to wake up and you need to know how to respond in that situation. It goes over how to store your naloxone, how to keep your naloxone safe when your naloxone expires, how to prevent the cops from taking it as much as you can. What else does it do? And then how to get more if you use it, and how to report back to us. We do collect data. We collect data from the people enrolling into the program, and we also collect overdose data if someone comes back and they're like, hey, I had to use my naloxone, I need more. So we collect data on that too. And luckily for me, these data nerds help me process it because I don't know how to do that. So these are the kits we hand out. The little black box in the corner, that is what the actual kit looks like. Oh, look at this. It's mine. Looks like that. In each kit comes 2 syringes, 2 bottles of naloxone, a CPR mask in case you don't want to put your mouth on somebody else's mouth. And all of that is wrapped up with instructions in case you forget everything I say 2 years later when you're needing to use your naloxone. So that's what's in the kits. Also, working for Outside In, which is kind of amazing. Outside In is a pretty large organization. We have multiple locations. We have a drop-in center. We have a federally qualified healthcare center. We've decided as an agency that having naloxone available in any of our client spaces is a priority for us. So in that, we have these amazing little metal boxes, actually made by that woman right there. She created those kits for me. And those are actually mounted throughout our agency, just kind of showing off what we have. And then we've trained about 60 of our staff, which is almost half of our staff, to use and respond to an overdose that would happen in our space as well. There's the inside of the fancy kit. Contrary to the little bottle I was holding up earlier, this is actually intranasal naloxone. I'm pointing. The pink boxes is intranasal naloxone, which is just a nasal spray. It's more expensive than the injectable kind, so it's like fancier. So where are we at right now? We have trained over 700 people to have and carry this drug since July. It's kind of insane. My initial goal when we started this was 300 in the first year, but the community has really stepped up and wanted to have it, and it's really important, and the clients really value it and have taken much more of an initiative to get it than I thought they would, which is awesome on them. So we've trained about 700 people. About half of those people tell me that they have overdosed at one time in their life or any time. 21% tell us that they have overdosed at least once in the last year. Pretty significant. 2/3 of them are under the age of 34, which is kind of bringing it back to kind of where we're at with seeing younger users, like 2/3 of the people getting trained. And that's actually not that different from our syringe exchange population either. This is a pretty fun picture. This is 1 week's worth of overdose reversals that got reported to me. In 1 week, we just sprawled them out to make them pretty. I think as of today, with the data entry I was doing before I got here, I think we hit 280 overdoses reversed, which is different than when I made this slide, a week ago? And we had 260 plus. So it's getting out there, people are using it, and it's amazing. A little bit of the data we collect on those, we ask clients, like, we want to confirm that they're actually doing rescue breathing, that they're calling 911, seeing kind of what's happening at the scene, where they're doing it, things like that. Cool fact that about half of them are happening in a private home, about half is in a private home, private residence. 39% is the street, a bunch of other random places. And we asked them who they were using it on. So did they use it on a friend, a family member, a stranger? 3/4 knew the person that was overdosing. The 13% of responses, those were complete strangers that nobody knew. Some of these stories are pretty crazy, of people like walking into Safeway and hearing someone say something about overdose and take off for a bathroom or stuff like that. The 8%, the 8% that used it on themselves, I think is really, really poignant, because most people in the survey Lindsay talked about earlier, when we asked people if they were worried about whether or not they would overdose, a lot of them weren't worried about themselves overdosing. They didn't really think, oh, it'll never happen to me, I know how to not overdose. But they were worried about their friends overdosing. And so and most people who are taking the training aren't like, I'm scared I'm gonna die of an overdose. It's more like, my girlfriend, I don't want to lose my girlfriend who I use with to an overdose. It's more of this idea of protecting their community. So 8% seems higher than I would have expected, but it's also kind of awesome. So, and that brings me to yet another story. And this is a story about a young woman. She's a PSU student. She's super cool, super nice chick. I've actually had classes with her at PSU, which has been kind of fun. But when she initially was in the exchange, when people ask about getting trainings done, usually one person will come and say, Haven, I want to get some naloxone. And I say, okay, cool, come on in. And then I stand up and yell out the door, who else wants naloxone? And usually other people come in, and that's great. And if people are kind of looking at me like I'm funny, I'm like, you know you want it. It's really important. You should do it. And I actually do make that face when I say that. It's true. And she decided to come in with that kind of like, I'm not forcing you, but... And she came in and she got trained. And she lives with her boyfriend who doesn't use opiates of any kind. And she decided she was going to show him about her naloxone and show him how to use the kit and show him what I knew, or I had shown her. And it was just a few weeks ago, she came into my office and she handed me a card. And she was standing in my door and she hands me this card. And I knew by the look on her face, because she was like this, I knew this card's gonna make me cry, basically. And she had overdosed, and her boyfriend had used the naloxone to save her life. And she felt compelled to write me a thank you card that started with the line, I have never had to write a thank you note for something so intangible that I can't actually touch. And it went on to say a bunch of other sappy things that made me cry a lot. And she was another person that never thought she would have needed naloxone for herself. And she really expressed that in the card, that she thought, oh, I'll just have it around in case somebody's using it at my house or whatever. But then she ended up needing it.
Haven has some pretty incredible stories, right? They're pretty remarkable. And at least I'm getting choked up. I don't know about you guys. But let's try to keep going. So if naloxone is having an effect in the community, we can expect to see a lot of different things. First, Haven's already saying we're hearing about reversals, right? So the most logical, simple equation we can think of is, if we have more naloxone in the community, our deaths related to opiates should be dropping. If we put more life-saving drug into the community to specifically help people who would be overdosing on opiates, we should expect to save some lives. Well, we have to think about how to actually ask that question, because from a data standpoint, it can get a little sticky. So again, July 9th of 2013, that's when Haven was allowed to start training people. Again, within 4 hours, she had the first batch trained. That is extremely exciting and impressive, and I wish I'd known her back then. Pretty cool time. So what we want to do is compare the time we had naloxone, or currently have it, with the time from before when we didn't have it. We don't want to do it, though, across 1 year. There's too many other factors that get involved. The seasons, or the entire international drug trade trends that might go up during 1 month and down in another. So instead, we're going to look at it across the years. And we're going to look at July 9th to December 31st in 2013. We're going to compare it to that same time period in 2012. And we can compare it back across as many years as we want. That controls for some of those other factors a bit. So let's take a look at what we have here. This is the medical examiner data looking at opiate-related deaths from 2009 to 2013, and we broke it down by drug types. So the orange bars are for prescription opiate deaths. The white ones are for heroin-related deaths. There is a little bit of overlap for people who use both. So if you look at those orange bars, there's really not a lot of change in there, right? We see that 21 to 20 to 19, that's one death difference each year. It's pretty much what we'd expect. I mean, there's nothing out of the ordinary there. But if we look at the white bars, so we saw a little drop in 2010, and then it shot up to 52 opiate-related deaths, specifically heroin, just in that window from July 9th to December 31st of 2012. The following year, just 1 year later, it dropped to 29, very suddenly. 52 to 29 is a 44% reduction in heroin-related deaths in just a very short window. That's not even the entire time that we've had naloxone in place. That 44% reduction, for those of you who like statistics and numbers, that is a statistically significant decrease at an alpha of 0.05. And that is exciting. That allows us to say with quite a bit of confidence that there is some external factor out there that is making that reduction happen. It's not just chance. So we like to say that this is naloxone. There's no other big factor that's changed within that time period, within this community. This is what we were looking for. This is what the legislators wanted when we passed this law. This is everything that we were hoping to see, and this is just the very beginning. So what we have found is this 44% reduction just at the end of 2013. We haven't even touched this year yet. That is extremely exciting, and this is something that we should all be cheering for. And we should know that this law and all of these trainings that we are doing are starting to make a difference.
Another story. So I think this is my last story, though, right? I think it is. So this is a story of a young lady who was, she and a friend were coming home from work. She works actually like a regular 9-to-5 kind of job, just like most of us. And she's rolling into her house, and she notices that her boyfriend is unconscious on the couch. And she panics, and she starts to cry. And she runs into the bathroom. And when she goes to push the bathroom door open, the door hits something and won't open. What the door hit was a complete stranger who her boyfriend had brought home with him, who was also overdosing simultaneously in the bathroom. Luckily for her, we give out 2 bottles of naloxone in each kit, as well as 2 clean syringes in each kit. And she had a buddy with her, like a friend of hers from work came home with her. And so they divided up the naloxone kit, were able to revive both the boyfriend and the stranger. And when she's telling me this story, she's crying in my office, and she's got tears streaming down her face. And she at one point looks up at me and she's like, Haven, I could have been crying in your office today for such a very different reason. That this drug is what allowed me to keep my partner alive. And my day would have been so different today if it wasn't for this naloxone. And it makes me chin quiver.
So what else are we going to do? Right now we have naloxone at Outside In, pretty much the only place that we know of in Oregon that is doing this work. What else is on the horizon? So first, like I said, I work for the county. We have 3 needle exchange sites. We want naloxone at our sites. We don't have it yet, but we are pretty much ready to go. We're waiting. My coworker's here. She's in charge. We're just waiting for we're just waiting for the naloxone to arrive. Basically, we have everything else, and it should be happening this month. So once that happens, moving on to bigger and better things, we did recently get a 3-year grant from the state health department. The Oregon Health Authority gave us some money to build naloxone capacity in the Tri-County area, Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas. And we're going to start with social service organizations, with treatment agencies, housing agencies, shelters, drop-in centers, whoever's interested, really. We've already had a lot of interest. Haven gets a phone call almost every day from someone at some agency in Portland or outside of Portland, even as far as Jackson County. people saying, how do we get this? How do we get our staff trained so they can rescue someone? Our clients overdose sometimes. We don't want people dying. How do we get our staff trained so they can train our clients? How do we start our own naloxone programs? This grant will allow us to do that. We have a list already. After that, we'd like to work with criminal justice, with the criminal justice system. I think we mentioned that the risk for overdose is much greater after you've been incarcerated, mostly because your tolerance has gone down. And we would love to do trainings in the jails. That's already happening in San Francisco, so that when someone walks out of jail, they will have naloxone on them. And we'd love to work with law enforcement. Just last month, the U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder said he called the increase in opiate overdose deaths across the country an urgent public health crisis. And one of the things he recommended was that police departments start carrying naloxone, that officers are trained and have it with them. That's important because police are often the first people on the scene when 911 is called, and if they beat the paramedics there, that's that much sooner that you can get naloxone to someone and you can get them out of an overdose. We would love to do that work. And there's a few other things that we were funded to do, but those are the main things I wanted to highlight. We are low on time, so I'm just going to skip this. I'll give this to Maya.
We want to be able to answer all your questions, so we will get to some of the other efforts and some of the other public health things that we are doing if you have questions. So, if we keep expanding access to naloxone, if we keep training people, what could happen in Oregon? First of all, we know that these opiate death trends are starting to go down. This is exciting in our county. We can start to see this across the rest of the state, and hopefully our numbers will keep dropping and eventually hit zero. We just need to keep going on the same track that we are now. There are states across the country where naloxone is already in place, where there are laws that have already been implemented and programs that have led to the successful distribution of this drug to the people who really need it. Oregon is well on its way to being one of these states, and hopefully we'll start seeing the same rapid decreases in deaths and incredible increase in life in our community that we have seen in all of these other states. For those of you who listen to the radio or read the newspaper, you've probably noticed some miserable headlines over the past few years, with heroin deaths increasing over the amount caused by meth and cocaine combined. It's pretty depressing. And college students in our area dying of heroin overdoses. Prescription deaths also increasing. We have been called Heroin City. Again, I haven't been here that long, but I figured out already that Portland is an incredible place, full of culture, full of life, full of beauty, and we deserve a much better title than Heroin City. Truly. Maybe some other things, but not that. So we hope that with naloxone spreading, we'll start to see some better headlines in the very near future. We know how, and we have the tools to continue to reverse this trend in opiate overdoses all across Oregon. And Multnomah County and Portland are leading the way in this. When we put naloxone into the hands of drug users and their parents and their loved ones, their siblings, their friends, when we put naloxone into the hands of people whose lives have been affected in some way by opiates, we're creating a safety net underneath them to catch them before they fall where we can't help them anymore and where they can't get back up again. If you remember one thing from this entire talk, from all the numbers and all the pictures and the graphics and all the stories, if you can remember one fact from tonight, we want you to remember this. Naloxone saves lives. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. We're going to go do some questions here, and we have a microphone up in the balcony and one down here on the bottom floor as well. And I'm going to get you another chair. There you go. And I'll grab the other microphone. I'm going to start off with a question that I know that some of you people in the audience probably have, and I know that's been in the newspaper and on our Facebook page and whatnot. There's a feeling that providing things like needle exchange or naloxone to people who are addicts is that it's somehow encouraging use of illegal drugs, and that we shouldn't be doing that, and that the people who are using somehow deserve whatever their fate is. I'm not saying that myself. I'm saying that other people have that opinion. Can you speak to that a little bit?
This is actually a really common question that we get asked a lot. Is does providing these kind of safety nets and these tools actually encourage drug use? And specifically with syringe exchange, it's incredibly researched. Like the 90s were full of syringe exchange research that said there is no increase in the amount of drugs that are used. And the thing with naloxone in particular, and the thing with the idea that if people know they're not going to die from an overdose, then they're just going to use more drugs. Well, people still die of overdoses. And getting naloxone is awful. If you are opiate dependent, it makes you incredibly sick. Not dangerously sick, but incredibly uncomfortable. So actually what we're hearing from people who are using this and who are getting this is more, instead of like, oh, I can use more because my buddy's got naloxone, it's more like, oh shit, my buddy has naloxone. I can't use as much because he will naloxone me no matter what. And I've actually heard people say that. Oh, I won't use with that guy anymore. If I start nodding out, he's just going to give me naloxone even if I don't need it. So it actually is because people really don't want that experience. It's not something we're seeing. I'm sure there's actually solid research that shows naloxone doesn't increase drug use, but I can't quote it right now. Lindsay, can you? No? Okay. Just checking. Yeah. I don't know where I'm looking. Oh, there you are.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering what the cost of naloxone is and where outside in's funding comes from.
Wah, wah, wah. So the syringe exchange at Outside In is funded primarily through Multnomah County Health Department. Our work with naloxone is coming from, in conjunction with our work from them, and it's coming out of syringe exchange budget. We also have a small grant from the Open Society Foundation, who actually the grant is for like the education part of it and like talking to audiences like this and talking to other alternative audiences. The funding for specific naloxone comes straight out of our syringe exchange budget. And you asked about cost of naloxone. I can't answer that. The long and short of it is I can't answer that. We have a contract with the drug company that says I can't. It retails for like $15 to $20 for the injectable and around $30 for the nasal spray.
I can read that it's sensitive to light. Does it have a shelf life or a half-life?
Oh, sorry. The naloxone I am handing out today expires November 1st, 2015. So, I mean, like any drug, it does have an expiration date because the drug companies want you to get more as soon as possible. This lasts for about 2 years, depending on where it's at.
Okay, as a resident across the river in Washington, I was wondering, I know we have one needle exchange program that my friend volunteers at. Do you know if they currently have a naloxone, I can't even say it,
Have they started?
naloxone program?
Aviel, do you know? I think they're kind of at the same stage as us. They're right on the cusp, probably waiting for their naloxone to arrive.
I have two questions. My first question is for Gary, more of a scientific question. You made the comment that you cannot overdose from the natural opium. Is that the natural in your body or the natural, the stuff found in nature, like plant?
The natural in your body stuff, the endorphins, enkephalins, dynorphins, that's, the body will rarely overdose itself on anything, or it won't physiologically overshoot. You can certainly overdose on all the natural opiates, opium, and all the derivatives, morphine, heroin, and you name it. You can overdose on that. But the question of whether you can overdose on endorphins is, it's an interesting philosophic question. How would you know the answer to that? But there are people who get abusive. I mean, they develop addictive behaviors to those things that increase endorphin production. So for example, the classic case is people who do long distance running because that generates endorphins. And you see people get into a really addictive pattern with long distance running. And it's been hypothesized that that's really an endorphin addiction that's going on there. But I'm not aware of any overdose with that.
So my second question is with the statistics out of Outside In who they self-administered the naloxone. Do you have? So what was the self? The 8%.
Yeah, it wasn't they didn't give the. I think there's been one person who told me he gave himself naloxone, but those are more like if I overdose and I have a prescription and Lindsay uses it on me. But I can't give more to Lindsay because she hasn't taken the class yet, but I can refill my own prescription for myself. So the story I was telling about the young lady that got trained and brought me the thank you card is an example of a self, because her partner hadn't been trained by me, but it was used on her.
I was going to say, how do you self-administer naloxone? Do you know you're about to slip into overdose, or how?
Typically not.
Okay.
Typically not.
Yes, I know this might be a long way off idea but with the trend of more young people getting into heroin because of prescription drug abuse, is there a long-term plan of maybe RAs at college or public health nurses at universities being trained in this as also a way of responding to the fact that you are getting college students who are heroin addicts and others?
I mean, in an ideal world where this is fully funded and there's lots and lots of different places, like people training, like right now it's just Outside In training anyone. And this grant has opened it up so like Lindsay, Aviel, and I can do a lot more work with training different community partners who want to have it on site. We're currently not anywhere near there. In my dream world, you would not be able to buy a first aid kit pre-made in the store that didn't have naloxone in it. That's what I want. Someday it'll be over the counter and it'll be in every first aid kit everywhere. And it will be like having rubbing alcohol in your house. That's what my dream is.
It is actually over the counter in Italy, and the FDA held a hearing 2 years ago to talk about having naloxone over the counter. Just fun fact.
So I start residency in July, and I'm wondering if I should prescribe naloxone to any patients in outpatient clinic that I'm thinking of giving opiates to. I mean, obviously, if I think a patient's at risk for an opioid overdose, then I don't want to write that prescription. On the other hand, there are patients who will screen positive for drug use or will come into a pain clinic or, for other reasons might have access to opioids who I'm wondering if I can give naloxone prescriptions to.
So the question is about prescribing naloxone for patients when you start your residency and knowing when or when not to do it in outpatient settings.
There's actually been an interesting project in Carolina looking at that. It's called Project Lazarus. And one of the things they do is co-prescription. So any patient who is on a significant amount of opiate, whether for acute pain like after surgery or chronic pain like ongoing low back pain, they are also given naloxone as a co-prescription so that they're equipped and their family members are trained in how to use it on them in order to protect them from overdose too. Because these overdoses do happen, and one of the powerful pieces of testimony we received during the legislative process was one of the representatives who had her mom overdose. And so it's not just a problem of people who are addicted to heroin. It's a fairly widely based problem, and where we're really seeing the success right now is among heroin users because that's who we're serving. But there's this whole huge mass of folks who are using opiates, prescription opiates, or traded prescription opiates, who also need attention.
Is naloxone able to boot anything else off those receptors, or is it only effective on opiates?
It's only effective on opiates, and indeed, opiates are about the only thing that bind with opiate receptors, exogenous or chemical opiates, and are endogenous or self-synthesized opiates. So those are the things that bind there. So it does not appear that it reverses any other overdose, like a Valium overdose or amphetamine or anything like that.
I want to geek out about data for a minute with that question. So one hat I wear is the medical examiner data hat. My newer hat now is ambulance data. And I learned recently while working with a lot of folks at AMR that, which is the ambulance guys, that when they are called to a scene and there's somebody who's not breathing, Naloxone is usually administered if they think it's an opiate overdose or not, because it's actually a very good way of telling if it's an opiate overdose or not. If they improve after you give the Naloxone, there's probably opiates involved. If they don't, as Gary said earlier, it has no effect. It's like shooting saline into your leg. It's not going to do anything. So it's an interesting thing from a data perspective, because we can narrow down who we're looking at by looking at if the Naloxone worked or if it didn't. Being a data nerd, sorry.
Are there federal policy changes that would be useful in spreading use of naloxone? And if so, what are the obstacles to making them?
I think in 2010, sometime in the last couple of years, a federal law was introduced. I don't think it ever went to the floor. And one was supposed to be introduced this year. It must not have happened because we would know about it. But that would be convenient. We wouldn't need 50 separate laws. Yeah, so maybe next time.
The best we get are some toolkits from some of the national agencies like SAMHSA. I don't know the acronym. It's a long one, but Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. They released an opioid overdose toolkit just last year, full of information for community partners and for individuals who want to do that and get information from the source, but no laws.
And then also the FDA just approved a new device for administering naloxone. It's like the neatest thing in the whole wide world. It is an auto injector that talks to you, and it's it like actually talks you through the steps and like tells you what to do. Like put it against the skin, push the button. I actually don't know what it says. I haven't heard it yet, but I think that's what it's going to say. And that is actually the first naloxone that's been approved for lay responders. So anyone who's not a medical professional, or not a doctor or a nurse, right, is a lay person. Not a paramedic, is a lay person. And so this is the first time that the FDA has approved naloxone to be used by these lay people that aren't like professionally trained. And that's expected to be released. It was pushed through the FDA much faster than the drug company that's making it was expecting it to. And that should be on the market late this summer. It'd be really awesome if the FDA would make naloxone over the counter in a situation that was affordable for people, because I'm guessing these naloxone devices are going to be pricey. But so that's something we can hope for too, coming from the feds, is the FDA to make it okay to buy it.
Thanks for this. It's been really informative. I'm curious. I was really surprised to learn that it's been around for as long as it has, since the 70s. I was curious if you could elaborate more on why this, if it has no effect other than like shooting up with saline, why this would be an illicit substance for such a long period of time.
It's not an illicit substance. It's not a controlled drug. It's an ordinary prescription drug. So so the controlled drugs, things like heroin, opium, all the narcotics, all the tranquilizers are controlled drugs, what are called scheduled drugs. Naloxone is not one of those. So but it is a prescription drug, except in Italy, and so that puts a barrier in front of it.
I also would say that, so the first naloxone distribution program started underground in Chicago in 1996. It's a long time ago. So, I mean, it has been something that was getting out in the community. It hasn't gotten out. It's just a new thing here that this is happening. I mean, historically, any doctor could, like, this law didn't change the fact that any doctor can prescribe this drug. Any nurse practitioner can prescribe this drug to anyone. And before the law changed, they could still do that to anyone who they were worried about overdosing. The thing with it is that if you're overdosing, you're not giving yourself this drug. So they didn't want to prescribe it. And there was not a lot of support from doctors to prescribe it. Partly because those conversations are really hard conversations to have with patients, too.
As a segue to that, so I recently moved from Dallas. That's on the 35 corridor. A lot of heroin coming in from Mexico. Huge problem in the high schools. And with their public health outreach programs in that area, they are actually targeting pediatricians in affluent suburbs because they want those pediatricians to give naloxone prescriptions to parents. Because that's where they've seen the increase in heroin overdoses is in 15, 16, 17-year-old people. So are we able to do anything at that level to reach out to pediatricians or school counselors to get these prescriptions? Because parents can ask for the prescription, right?
We could do that before the passage of the Senate bill, and we can do it now. The challenge is always to get the medical community, and I'm a doctor, but to get the medical community aligned and to get enough docs doing things in a consistent way that it actually has a major population effect. So, you know, if 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 10 pediatricians do this with selected patients, it may help some of their patients, but it's not going to have a big community effect. So the bigger targets here are community-based naloxone, like it's happening at Outside In and will be happening in other agencies. And then there's a whole other, you know, Mayan talked about, we got to work at a lot of different levels to get people out of the river. And the biggest issue here is that we have a huge amount of opiates that are being prescribed in the community. Absolutely huge numbers and incredible increases over the past 15 to 20 years. And that use leads to dependency, and that dependency ultimately, for some folks, half in the case of the Outside In cohort, led to heroin abuse, which is a more potent way to be overdosed and to have the whole array of problems that are associated with addiction. So we really need to look at a lot of different layers here. Physicians, pediatricians prescribing for kids on the theory that their parents may catch them in the act of overdosing is not a bad idea. It's a question of how does that measure up with the other things we can do.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 more. I've got one right here in the front.
So this is kind of along the same lines, but about adolescents, and I'm curious about their access to it, their use of it, and what's going on with educating adolescents, specifically those under 18.
It's a tricky one. So Oregon state law is that so part of this is coming back to the fact that in the state of Oregon, anyone under the age of 18, regardless of whether they're using heroin or not and need access to clean needles or not, if you're under 18, you can't come in. So it's a state law. We have a law on the books that says I can't give needles or provide services to people under the age of 18. And there's not much I can do about that. We have not had anyone under the age of 18 ask for naloxone. I haven't turned anyone away because they weren't 18, which is a good thing to know. But I can provide HIV testing and Hep C testing to those people, but I can't provide naloxone at this time to them. And yeah, I'm hoping for herd immunity, that if people get enough, if there's enough naloxone in the community, that these 17 and 18, or 16 and 17-year-olds will be protected because their peers are protected through herd immunity, but right now we're not there yet.
Okay, one more down here in the front.
You've talked about how much more opiates are being prescribed. Are you seeing a huge increase unique to Multnomah County or to Oregon, or is it part of a national trend? Is it the same everywhere, or are we just particularly anxious to relieve pain?
The really short answer is that this is a national trend that's been ongoing for many years. The slightly longer answer is that back when I trained in medicine back in the late 70s, our training in pain management was pathetic. And we undertreated people for acute pain, we undertreated people for cancer pain. And what ended up happening is we finally started to get it right in the late 70s and 80s in terms of cancer pain and acute pain. And then the focus shifted to chronic non-cancer pain. So people with chronic back pains, chronic headaches, etc. And that led to this whole idea of the sixth vital sign and that you should check pain with every patient on every visit the same way you check pulse and temperature. And it turns out that that new focus on pain management and pain control led to a huge increase in the prescription of opiates, and that increase was not well justified by what we knew about the effectiveness of these drugs, and it was not justified by what was early emerging data about the dangers of taking that approach. So, I think the medical community, our hearts were in the right place, but we proceeded without the benefit of science. And I will have to say that there's ample evidence that the drug companies funded the groups that promulgated the guidelines that led to increased prescribing. So, none of this is really an accident.
Is Oregon unique?
Oregon is not unique in that regard, and you'll see the same problem all over the country. I mean, Oregon was somewhat unique back in the late 1990s in terms of having a huge, the first place to have some really huge increases in heroin overdose deaths, but the prescription drug increase has really been a national trend, and actually probably worse in the east and the southeast of the country.
But Oregon is especially high in terms of illicit use of prescription opiates. So that survey talked about earlier that showed young people using heroin, they also have shown, the last time they did it, I believe we were second in the nation in terms of illicit use of prescription opiates in the past year. So.
Well, on that note, but what was the takeaway that you said, Maya?
I don't know, guys, what was the takeaway?
Naloxone saves lives. So let's say thank you to our speakers this evening. I think this one's a little better. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you to Mayan, to Gary, to Lindsay, and to Haven for being here this evening. If you have more questions, you're welcome to come up and talk to them. They'll be up here and can talk to you further. Please, if you haven't already filled out our evaluation, please do that. If you need more, there's some at the back table. Put your email address on the back and we will send you more information about the upcoming events. And come see us at the Clinton Street Theater on June 3rd to find out about trash. And have a fabulous evening and thank you for coming.